Hi there YouTube friends, Richard Lewis here, back with another video, and what I want to talk about is something that's a bit of a departure to what I usually talk about. It's not going to be anything to do with esports or gaming directly, but I think it's an important topic. I'm sure you'll have seen it on the internet yourself, and that is that two modern feminist icons, and indeed two people at the heart of the anti-Gamergate movement, and indeed the Gamergate situation, Anita Sarkeesian and Quinn, they were granted an audience with the United Nations to discuss something very close to their heart, and that is the attacks against women on the internet. Now, they did so at a summit entitled Cyberviolence Against Women and Girls, a Global Wake-Up Call. And the central premise of this summit, and indeed their points, were that women are more likely to have negative experiences on the internet, that women are going to be subject to this very nebulous and strange term cyberviolence, which I can presume is threats and abuse, verbal abuse, written abuse, and that the current machinery in place doesn't protect women from this, and that moving forward we need to alter that machinery radically so we can do something about that. Now, the first thing, and this is a fairly obvious joke and a fairly obvious line of thought for anybody, I'm almost loath to include it, but let's just do it anyway because I do think it's worth scrutiny. A lot of these modern feminists, and indeed that term social justice warrior types, they like to use that term privilege, white privilege, male privilege, everyone's privileged. And there's these marginalized groups that don't get to share in that privilege. Now, obviously, I do agree to a term. It's very obvious to spot a marginalized group in society. It's very obvious from looking at legislature or just how interactions with people. Lots of anecdotal evidence, statistical evidence. There are obviously some groups that enjoy privilege ahead of others. However, it is worth pointing out that what could be more privileged than getting an audience with the United Nations to discuss your feelings and what the United Nations are going to do about it. What sort of global mandate can you introduce to improve things for you? That seems an incredibly privileged position to be in. I think it's extraordinary. I can't think of anything akin to it from any other sort of internet phenomenon to date. Now, it's worth mentioning, of course, the United Nations is some overblown, bumbling, incompetent organization. I'm a member of Amnesty International. I have the sore misfortune to know this firsthand, and they rely on a lot of sort of celebrity ambassadorship, and they're not very effective. I mean, for example, while I appreciate they might want to look at other issues and sort of get involved in the minutiae of what we're experiencing in the Western world and what's important to us and what affects people on the internet and this kind of thing, I can clearly think of other issues that are far more pressing. For example, we've got a refugee crisis, it's being called in the media, in Central Europe. That doesn't seem to be resolved. There seems to be a lot of conflict and negativity coming out of that, and people are actually dying as a result of it. People are coming from these war-torn countries to try and get a better quality of living, and they're traveling in incredibly dangerous manners. And when they do, very often, if they're caught, they're deported. They're put in internment camps. I mean, this is quite shocking. And I feel the United Nations, the clue is in their title, should probably be doing a little bit more about that, and certainly indulging frivolous and woolly nonsense like the feelings of radical feminists on the internet does seem to pale in comparison. In addition to that, obviously, we've got the situation from Syria, where we've got a civil war in place where, it's horrible what's happening to the people out there. And of course, they're not isolated, even though it probably is the most horrible example of modern global atrocities and deaths pertaining to a civil war from a particularly small country. It's again, I kind of feel the United Nations would be better focused on that. But alas, they're not. Alas, they can sort of make time for this, and I suppose that's fine. I suppose it's perhaps a little bit naive to believe that the United Nations, it's all one division, so if they're focused on feminist feelings, they can't be focused on other things. Obviously, that's not true. But again, I still feel that in terms of priorities, this should be way, way down the list. And equally, I want to say as well that the radical feminists like Zoe Quinn and Anita Sarkeesian, and again, I don't believe Anita Sarkeesian is real, actually. I think she's got a touch of the Easter Bunny about her. She clearly seems an avatar for an idea that's very lucrative right now. And if you think about all of the people that are talking about white privilege and wealth and the horror of the patriarchy, obviously these are all very affluent, middle to upper class white females, and in some cases obviously white males as well. And they're in a position of privilege. They can pretend that they're not, but they obviously are. By their own definitions, they are, unless we completely ignore wealth and a high standard of living, and indeed living in the decadent West. If we want to ignore all of those things as being privileged, I certainly do feel privileged. Perhaps not in the way they would talk about, but when I look at some of the suffering that people are going through globally, I have to say yes. Well, we're all incredibly privileged, aren't we? However, it seems to be that they don't focus on these big issues. They focus on Twitter fights and forum wars and social media spats. They talk about anonymous threats as if they're the worst thing. Meanwhile, globally, let me highlight some of the issues that Anita Sarkeesian and Zoe Quinn aren't really talking about. And just recently, we've had reports coming out of Chile that they've banned abortion, and it's causing women to seek illegal abortions. But you can be reported to the police for having an abortion. I don't really see any championing from these radical online feminists for that, for example. And indeed, what's somewhat depressing, but not surprising, is the mainstream media haven't really picked up on the fact that right now, it's just finished actually by the time this video will go out, we have the United Nations Sustainable Development Committee, or Summit rather, and they're talking about in how we can basically get out of poverty by using more sustainable development methods the world over. There was a speech there from the Amnesty International's Secretary General, and one of the big issues that were actually brought up there was talking about how hundreds of millions of people are living in global poverty and suffering as a result of it. And in particular, one of the focuses of this speech was how in underdeveloped nations, women and girls routinely suffer physical violence and multiple human rights violations. You want to talk about rape culture, you should look at some of the countries where women aren't even allowed to have any physical control over their body, their biology, and are indeed treated like cattle. This is a far more pressing matter to me, as someone who would describe themselves as a humanist, than the feelings that you encounter when somebody tweets something mean at you. However, they didn't stick around for that. They didn't seem to be too interested in getting involved in that. So I think that's very important to recognize. Now, back to what they wanted the United Nations to get involved in and to look at, was they presented their own anecdotal experiences and waxed lyrical about how horrible they were, how they were living some sort of day-to-day nightmare at the hands of these anonymous males on the internet. And yet when you look closely at some of the incidents that they're talking about, it doesn't seem to pertain to cyberviolence at all. In fact, I would be loath to include the word violence. It's barely even abuse, actually. So Anita Sarkeesian used a quote which has been put many times out there now as a result of this meeting. They said that she said harassment doesn't simply consist of what is legal and illegal, but it's also the day-to-day grind of you're a liar and you suck, including hate videos that attack us on a regular basis. Now, as somebody that lives a life in the public eye, and I guess I have to sort of accept that it's not particularly glamorous, it's not hugely public eye, but I'm a relatively prominent figure in a very niche concern on the internet, namely esports, but it's growing all the time, and I've sort of grown up with it, and as a result, I too get that abuse, and I too have videos that target things I've said and done, and I honestly just sort of retaliate a lot of the times on social media. Like I'm not too upset or offended by it, even if it does sometimes draw the ire out of me. But at no point would I call it cyber violence. I've had threats where I've had to leave the house for a few days just to be absolutely certain. And again, I find this idea of cyber violence quite strange. I don't believe anybody should have to go through non-stop abuse. It can be very soul-destroying. I've made tweets to myself. I mean, I've nearly quit my career several times because I don't think the abuse sometimes outweighs the benefits. But the idea that I would want to lobby or petition anyone to alter the internet and what a great bastion for freedom of speech it can be, it just wouldn't even occur to me to do that predicated on my feelings. It wouldn't. I think Twitter, for example, can do a lot more to prevent abusive accounts, but I don't support what's happening in the UK, which is people are being arrested and sometimes jailed for abusive Twitter and Facebook posts. I don't want that to become a global norm. I absolutely don't want that to escalate and become worse. I think it just seems so egregious and so over the top for it. Now, the other thing, of course, is, let's be real. If you produce a piece of content and people don't like it, they're going to tell you that it sucks, and by extension, you suck. I've never had a problem with that specifically. Like, that's not an issue. That's your entitlement. If I go to see a film and I don't like it, I'm entitled to ask for my money back. I mean, that goes without saying, right? I'm entitled to perhaps even tweet at the director. You know, you've got a Twitter, and it's probably run by an intern or whatever, but I'm going to tweet you and say, yeah, the film was shit. Now, what do I need to be banned from the cinematic experience? Do I need to be removed from social media for this? Well, no. You have to understand that when you create content, people are going to critique it. And yes, that critique will very often on the internet go over into the extremes. But again, the idea of silencing critique is a ridiculously, it's just a ridiculously dangerous idea, basically. If you start silencing critique en masse, this is perhaps the most repellent form of censorship you can do, because it gives people carte blanche to do terrible things, to create awful things, to be bad in their jobs, in their roles, to say whatever they like and be completely immune to any of the pushback against it. So it's not something I'd ever endorse. Now, the other thing was that this research document they provided was just absolutely awful. It had so many mistakes in it, and I don't know why I do know why a journalist hasn't done this, but I would expect a publication like maybe Breitbart or certainly a few more of the more open publications to have thought about this. But I would take the presentation and I would send it to someone in academia and get their opinion on whether or not this would pass muster as a dissertation, because it's absolutely appallingly sourced, and indeed in some cases it's frankly embarrassing. You would be marked down for example, there's an incident where one of the sources is someone's C drive. They didn't even proofread the sources. Now, I spent 5 years in academia, I guess, standard UK university experience, and it was your bibliography, your annotations, that counts towards your final mark. You have to be completely above board. They have to be able to find the source. You have to be able to verify what you're saying, and in this instance, unfortunately, it falls incredibly short. There was a number of blank citations, for example, in the report. And keep in mind, this is a report that's being presented to the United Nations, on which they're being petitioned to make rulings about potential internet censorship. This is a very important issue globally. And that's the irony, I guess, that if you were to censor the internet, it probably wouldn't be the Western people that would suffer too much, although it would be a massive overstep and an overreach of free speech laws, and would probably be challenged successfully in court if there was ever anything that came of it. But of course, it's sort of the lesser nations, not lesser, you know what I mean, the less liberal, less democratic nations, where there is already huge egregious censorship in place. It would be those nations that would suffer even more. These laws could be used to further suppress what is already limited speech, and especially if it was recognized globally and put in place by the United Nations. So I think this is incredibly important for those nations that have less democracy and less freedom of speech and less civil rights and civil liberties in place. And they've got to be absolutely on point about this. This is it's not something you can play around with. So the fact that the citations are so terrible should be really alarming. It should be triggering everyone, dare I say it. So you can see as well there were a number of sources that don't exist. So I'm not talking about blank sources, but I'm talking about actual citations that were put in that simply aren't real. This happened where I think they linked to I think it was a piece that was on Mother Jones, if I remember rightly. Basically, these citations were for pieces of work that just, the pieces of work existed, but what they were saying was in the pieces of work wasn't. It wasn't real. It just didn't happen. Then there was, of course, some very bold assertions about definitions, which there are sources out there for this, but they just didn't feel they had to include them. So, for example, their definition of doxing featured no citation whatsoever. There was no official definition. It was just simply presented as the internet-based practice of researching and broadcasting personally identifiable information about an individual, which I think is a fair summary. But again, from a legislative point of view, you need to be absolutely certain that what you're doing is accurate and fair, and you need to be able to cite that. So I think in the end they later included a Wikipedia link, and again the idea that something with a bold something that's such as a bold premise as to the United Nations needs to pass legislature on it. If you're using Wikipedia for anything like that, which of course can be altered and certainly isn't considered definitive by any way, shape or form, academics would laugh at you. This is very worrying indeed, and there was over 100 citations, I think, and yeah, it just seemed to be a really shoddily put together piece of work. And indeed, if you look back at what it talked about, it referred to some of the old games, which was like, there was an article going back from 2000. Of course, this is like 2015, almost 2016. A lot has changed culturally since then. And in that, it talked about an army psychologist's theories, Lieutenant Colonel David Grossman, and he accused Nintendo of manufacturing equipment for satanic video games. Now, maybe some of you aren't old enough, but I've been around a while. I've gone through several patches of hysteria. And I remember the first quite distinctly. It was in the 80s, and it was surrounding video nasties. I was very young at that time, but as we moved into the 90s, it was quite clear to me that there were certain videos that were talked about in hushed tones. There was this, there were certain things you couldn't watch. I remember Abel Ferrara's Driller Killer was one of them. Texas Chainsaw Massacre was banned over here for ages. I remember as a very young kid in school, people even talking about Texas Chainsaw Massacre like that it was some sort of snuff movie. And of course, none of this was true, and obviously kids don't need to know that. But this is the kind of hysteria that was coming out. Every time a new movie that pushed the boundaries was released, I remember headlines from great newspapers, that's sarcasm, like The Sun and the Daily Mirror. When David Cronenberg released his reimagining of The Fly, I remember lots of hysteria around that, like, has it gone too far? Body horror, shows a penis in a cabinet, grown men fainting in the aisles. None of these things are true, of course. It was just tabloid sensationalism at its worst. So, in the 90s, we obviously started moving towards, this is when it really started happening for computer games. There was pushback on cinema, which of course people suddenly were saying all cinema has artistic merit. Video nasties are ridiculous, and things like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Straw Dogs was another one. Indeed Clockwork Orange, they started getting banned in the 90s, and we were sort of allowed to consume them legally for the first time in the UK. But then we really started moving on to games. Games became a very big thing. to attack. And music, of course, as well in the 90s. There was constant hysteria about music. We had the typical parental advisory stickers that came out. Gangster rap was demonized, and then this was followed by rock music that was being demonized. Court cases against bands because someone played a record backwards and shot themselves, and Satanism was just permeated through that. I remember when Dungeons and Dragons was called a satanic board game. They even did a version, an episode of a detective show called Taggart. I'm pretty sure it was Taggart, where they had Dungeons and Dragons players in it, and somebody had been killed, and it turned out that they were all fucked in the head and thought it was real, and it was kind of like the CSI thing that happened surrounding Gamergate. So these cycles just repeat themselves. And again, the idea of Satanism, it's so ridiculous that this is even in this particular document. What has Satanism got to do with anything? Like, honestly, at this stage, who cares? But Satanism was sort of the buzzword for it. Satanic bands, satanic games. So we lurched from just sort of one hysteria to another. And to use something this old and to include something that ridiculous, frankly, is appalling. Of course, as well, there was some talk, about school shootings. That's got to be in there, of course. David Grossman, he was on TV in the aftermath of Columbine, and he was supporting the view that video games train school shooters, which of course we've heard again, time and time again. So this, to me, lacks any critical credibility. This guy is an evangelical. He's a lunatic. Straight away, he obviously has some sort of inherent bias because he's in the military. I'm pretty sure, for example, for somebody from the military to be condemning video games as training tools, when in actual fact the tank controls that they use at the recruitment centres, and indeed in the tanks themselves, look like Xbox controllers, even down to the 4-button configuration. It's just hypocrisy, stupidity, hysteria, and it's moral crusading. Has no place in academia. So the sources they were using anyway, when they were correctly cited, were ridiculous. Now, just to introduce a bit more of myself about this, way back in the day, I was an NUS representative. That's the National Union for Students. It was an elected position, and my job was basically to go to meetings and to try and bring about policy change on behalf of, I guess you could call them constituents, but obviously it's not kind of true, but the people who elected me ultimately, the student body. And I was there. I witnessed in the late 90s the birth of what would go on to become social justice warriors. And again, this talk of privilege, and how women are oppressed and women have it bad, and men are these animals that basically on a day-to-day basis we simply suppress our urges to rape women, but that's secretly what we're all thinking about. And I never believed for a second that these radical feminists would ever become normalized, that this would ever be entertained. I used to find it quite absurd, and indeed so did most of the student body at that time. This was at a time where I used to regularly battle with our women's officer, who was also an elected NUS representative. And to give you an idea of her politics, when she was the welfare officer at the university I attended, for breast cancer awareness, we had a full week, posters, pink everywhere, ribbons everywhere, you name it, it was there. I think we even had several prominent, doctors come in, free screenings organised and everything. When testicular cancer awareness came around, she put up the total sum of one poster, and that was predicated on the reasoning that men are more doctors are men have better tools, better awareness. We don't need to be told about things that threaten us because we're in a position of power and privilege and status. And actually, it was this that led to us getting a men's officer appointed. I think we're one of the few universities to do that. It certainly wouldn't happen in this day and age, but somebody that was specifically appointed for men's welfare, because it was clear she wasn't fit for purpose doing her job. But again, as I said, I used to go to these meetings for NUS, and it would be ridiculous. It would be, first, if you could even get the meetings done, because you'd have all these Trotskyists and other idiots basically kind of stalling the meetings by organising meaningless sit-ins. Then once you got down to it, anything that was trying to be proposed that these groups didn't like, they would simply stall out. They would just vote for an amendment, a meaningless amendment. They try and combine things they wanted. And then when stuff that would make a genuine benefit to students' lives were being discussed, very often they never got put through. For example, things like, let's have somebody responsible for looking at properties before they go on an approved housing list, so students aren't living in slums. Seems like a good idea, right? Seems like the kind of thing we would do. Let's have a capped amount for union-served alcohol, because obviously students like to drink and like to party, and they don't have a lot of money to do it. These were the issues that were being talked about by the students when they were talking to me. Generally, what we would do is we would spend meetings talking about what is NUS's official policy on Israel versus Palestine, as if a group of students were going to come to some sort of unilateral understanding of the issue and be able to enforce some sort of policy globally. Like Israel are going to be like, oh, holy shit, have you heard NUS don't want to do this anymore? Fuck it, like, we're out. Let's get out. Well, you can have the West Bank. Fuck it. It's just, it's crazy. So I never believed that this would happen. But the key point to all of this was I saw the ignorance firsthand. I saw the assertions. I saw that they would talk about these disparities in money, and they would talk about all these other issues. And yet when you presented statistical data that challenged what they said, they simply wouldn't accept it. It just wouldn't enter their rationale. And I naively believed that would be the end of that. You would never see these people again. They simply couldn't exist in the adult world. Well, here we are in 2015, and they're incredibly prominent. They're actually sort of calling the tune. So that leads me to my final point. Now, if this central assertion, the premise of the whole talk about cyberviolence against women, is that women are more likely to experience, then I would refer people to a Pew study, from the Pew Research Center, that simply isn't the case. Statistically, this data proves that we actually, if anything, would require a summit for male cyberviolence. It said here, and this is what I mean, this is everybody's problem. 60% of internet users said they'd witnessed someone being called offensive names. 53% had seen efforts to purposefully embarrass someone. 25% had seen someone being physically threatened. 24% witnessed someone being harassed for a sustained period of time. 19% said they witnessed someone being sexually harassed. 18% said they had seen someone be stalked. Then, for the people who had personal experience of online harassment, 27% of internet users have been called offensive names, 22% have had someone try to purposefully embarrass them, 8% have been physically threatened, 8% have been stalked, 7% have been harassed for a sustained period, and 6% have been sexually harassed. So you think, well, this is actually an issue. But if you go through the study, here's what we find. That men are somewhat more likely than women to experience at least one of the elements of online harassment. This is a direct quote from the study itself. 44% versus 37%. So 44% of men on the internet will experience at least one of the elements of online harassment, compared to 37% of women. And this is generally name-calling, embarrassment, and physical threats. And this is where I think it's really interesting, women were, and again this is the direct quote from the study, women were more likely than men to find their most recent experience with online harassment extremely or very upsetting. So 38% of harassed women said so of their most recent experience, whereas 17% of harassed men internalize things and they just get on with it. Sorry, so rather the majority of men internalize and get on with it, but 70% of harassed men said it was very upsetting. They described it as very upsetting. So you can see immediately that actually it's a male issue, if anything. We receive more threats of violence, we receive more verbal abuse, and yet we are greatly less likely to take it to heart to want to do anything about it. Now, this is a study from 2014, certainly a lot more recent than the citations that we used in this UN report, and I'm amazed actually that this didn't come up. And I think we're getting to a stage now where this hysteria about women being attacked on the internet without any substantial data, we're simply relying on the anecdotal feedback of two people who are making money from their victimhood. I think we really need now to sort of question how far this is going to go, how ridiculous it's going to get. Because the situation I see two people managing to get the ears of a powerful, if ineffective and incompetent organization, to present them a report that's predicated on lies, false information, outdated information, incredibly poorly sourced, and people are taking this seriously. There were people in the audience getting up and crying hysterically as if they were meeting people who were in line for sainthood, or people who had truly experienced trauma, weeping for them despite having nothing wrong with them themselves and having no common experience in line with these people. So this is critical mass, I think, because if the UN decides to act on this, even though data points to the contrary, we've got a real problem, and it's going to have to be time to push back against it. So, all told, I think the final quote to end the video is that the end of the report does say that 92% of internet users agreed that the online environment allows people to be critical of one another compared with their offline experiences. And a substantial majority, 68%, agreed that online environments allow them to be more supportive of one another. This hasn't been talked about. This isn't being talked about. The internet isn't being talked about as a tool that brings people together. None of the positives are being talked about. Instead, what we're doing is we're tunneling in on a super specific series of incidents that affect a very small handful of people, and we are using them to basically say this is how the landscape of the internet is. It would be a travesty if this was taken more seriously than some of the more pressing matters, which I would urge the UN to focus on instead. And it would be an absolute travesty if people were to take this at face value, given that all data points to the contrary. So anyway, thanks very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you on the next one. All the best.